How's it going, guys? Welcome back to the channel. My name's Gianluca. I'm a second-year Canadian medical student, and I'm pretty sure this is going to be my most ambitious video ever. What we're going to be doing today is going over how to get into every single Canadian medical school. That's all 17 of them. I tried to look for a guide similar to this online already, but to the best of my knowledge, this is the very first one that has the updated statistics as of right now for every single school. The Canadian medical schools are some of the most competitive to get into in almost the entire world. And for those of you that are trying to get in, one of the most important things to do is to apply as broadly as possible. But in order to do that, you need to know what each of the different universities are looking for in their applicants. So that's where I thought I'd help out a little bit. I spent my last week after class, like in medical school normally, going to all of the different medical school websites, looking up all of their stats, and we're only going to be talking about the official information from the school websites here today. Also, I'm going to be sure to timestamp this entire video, and that way you guys can just go ahead and jump around to the most important parts for you. Now, I'm really hoping that this video is going to be able to help some people out. If it did, feel free to flatline that like button below. Leave me a comment letting me know what medical schools you're looking to get into, and beyond that, if you guys want to know a little bit more about the different schools, be sure to check directly on the school websites. I'm going to go ahead and link all of the official resources in the description below. Now that we've gone through all that, let's get started. So we're going to be dividing up the 17 different Canadian medical schools into 3 different categories. That's going to be the Ontario medical schools, the Quebec medical schools, and then the medical schools from the rest of Canada. So I'm going to be going through all the different schools in under 90 seconds. That way we keep this video as short as possible. But we're going to be starting off with the University of British Columbia, or UBC. For their acceptance stats, the most recent ones that I could find, they had 2,558 applicants for a total of 288 seats. And out of those seats, a maximum of 29 were allowed to go to out-of-province applicants. In terms of prerequisite courses, you'll see that you need 2 half-year courses of English, but that's 6 credit hours. In terms of GPA, you'll see that the average for in-province applicants was an 88.27, and for out-of-province applicants, you needed around a 91.94. Now, it's not to say that people with less than this average haven't gotten into the class, but when you do look at the successful applicants, that's approximately what their average was. Now, the MCAT is going to be used for your application, but only if you are able to make it to the interview step. The average MCAT scores for the applicants was a 128.7 for physics, a 127.2 for cars, a 129 for bio, and then a 128.7 for the last section, so that's the psych and social section. The non-academic requirements, you're going to be given a NAC score by the school, and that basically reflects your extracurriculars, your employment experience, and your research. And then you also need to submit some references, but again, that's only if you make it to the interview step. And finally, UBC does not use the CASPer test. You are going to get some bonuses if you have a graduate degree. That's only going to come in if you progress to the interview step. And then finally, applications are only open to permanent residents or citizens of Canada. Now, moving on to the next school, the second one that we're going to be talking about is the University of Alberta, or U of A. This is going to be the first time where we're really going to see that not all of the schools report their statistics the same way. The only thing that I was able to find about U of A is that on average they have 162 seats per class. For the GPA, what you're going to see is that there's 2 different things. There's the minimums, where if you have a GPA below this, you're actually not able to apply to the school at all. And the minimums for the Alberta applicants is a 3.3 GPA, and the minimum for out of province is a 3.5. But you'll see that the students that actually got in had a little bit of a higher average, and you'll see that for the Alberta applicants, it's about a 3.81. Out of province, it's about a 3.89. Now, U of A does use the MCAT, so I'm going to go ahead and you see the averages and the minimums right there for the MCAT, and they also do the CASPer test, which is an online situational judgment test. If you guys need help with the CASPer test, I actually have an entire guide to the test up on the channel already. Now, U of A also has some non-academic requirements. They have their personal activities section, which is a supplementary application. You also need to fill out 3 small essay questions, which are the personal highlights, and then finally 2 references. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find an official breakdown that talks about how much each part of your application is weighted, but most likely what's going to happen is that they're going to take all of the different things on your application into their final account. Next, we have the University of Calgary. What you'll see is they had 1,551 applications for a total class size of 144, and a maximum of that total class size, 15% is allowed to go to out-of-province applicants. In terms of their GPA, they also have minimums that are going to be different for out-of-province versus in-province applicants, but overall the average was about a 3.87. Now, the University of Calgary will use the MCAT, but they will only look at the CAR section of the MCAT, and they're similar to McMaster like that. You'll see that the average was a 127.7, but the cutoff is 128 for out-of-province applicants. Now, this school doesn't require the CASPer test at all, but they are going to need some non-academic requirements. requirements. Specifically, that is the autobiographical application as well as some references. What was really awesome about the website was that the selection process is broken down very clearly. In the pre-interview stage, it's going to be 50% academic and 50% non-academic. For the 50% academic, you're going to see that 20% goes to GPA, 10% goes to your MCAT CARS, 10% goes to the Global Academic Assessment of Merit, and then finally the last 10% goes to your intellectual curiosity. Go ahead and look up what all of those different things mean on the website itself. As far as the non-academic side pre-interview, 10% is given to your communication skills, 10% for interpersonal skills, 10% for evidence of maturity and resilience, 10% for organization, and finally 10% for advocacy. For the applicants that do make it to the interview, in order to make it into the class, it's going to be broken down to two different things. 50% is going to be given for your MMI score on the interview, and then 50% is going to be given for your pre-interview score. Next is going to be the University of Saskatchewan. And what you're going to see for them is that they had 564 applicants in total for a total number of 100 seats, of which 8 of those seats go to out-of-province applicants. In terms of your GPA, the average was an 88.27. However, the minimum was greater than 75% for Saskatchewan applicants and then greater than 85% for out-of-province applicants. They do something called a UAA, that's like their GPA calculation, and there's many different ways that they break this down, so be sure to look at that on their website. As far as the MCAT goes, I'm going to have the cutoffs up on the screen here, but what you're going to see is their average was a 73rd percentile, that's a 508 across their entire class. However, for the successful out-of-province applicants, these actually needed at least a 519, like that was the lowest score for that applicant. Now the school also uses the CASPer test, and as far as non-academic requirements go, you don't need an additional supplementary application, but you are going to need 3 references who may be called by the school. In terms of the selection process, what you're going to see is that the Saskatchewan applicants is 30% for their UAA, 20% for the MCAT, and then 50% for their MMI score. And then finally, the out-of-province applicants is going to be 100% decided based on the performance on their MMI. Now, school number 5 is going to be the University of Manitoba, and they actually break down their statistics into 3 different applicant pools. In terms of their overall acceptance stats, they had 877 applications for a total of 110 seats. Less than 6 are allowed to go to out-of-province applicants. In terms of their GPA, they reported on a 4.5 scale instead of the traditional 4.0 scale. Now, the in-province applicant average was a 4.18. The out-of-province average is not listed, and that's because if less than 6 people get into the class, or less than a certain amount, they won't show the average score for confidentiality reasons to the applicants. So it shows that not a lot of out-of-province applicants are getting in. In terms of Indigenous applicants, the average GPA was a 3.77. Now the school does use the MCAT test. They use the entire MCAT test, and those are going to be the average for successful applicants. They also use the CASPer test, and in terms of non-academic requirements, you're going to have to give some references for the people that do progress to the interview step. And you're also going to have to factor in an equity and diversity factor for each application, which that formula and how they do that is up on their website. In terms of the selection process, 15% is going to go to the GPA, 40% is going to the MCAT, 35% goes to the MMI or your interview, and then 10% is going to go to the CASPer test. Also, the equity and diversity factor is going to be applied to each individual applicant. And for the Indigenous applicants that do progress to the interview stage, you could actually be chosen directly after the panel interview. School number 6 is Dalhousie Medical School in Nova Scotia. They had 1,068 applications for a total of 116 seats, of which 9 seats are allowed to go to students that are not from the maritime regions. They had an average GPA of 3.9, and this is going to be taken from the 2 best years of study, and there's many different ways that you could go and assess GPA. Look that up on their website. There's also some minimums where there's 3.3 for maritime students and then 3.7 out of 4 for non-maritime students. The school is also going to use the MCAT test. They're going to use all the sections, and the average was a 510, and then they use the CASPer test as well. The CASPer test is only used as a cutoff in this case. Students that get less than negative 1.5 standard deviations on the test are not going to progress to the next step. In terms of the non-academic requirements, there's actually going to be a supplemental essay, as well as a 5% bonus for outstanding features, which could be given based on the discretion of whoever's reading the applicant's application. In terms of the selection process though, 15% is going to go to your GPA, 10% for your MCAT, 30% for the supplementary essay, 40% for your interview, and then finally that last 5% is for that discretionary bonus that we just talked about. Now school number 7 is the Memorial University of Newfoundland, or MUN, and this is going to be one of the schools where really I just couldn't find many many statistics on for the application process. What you'll see is that they had 750 to 800 applications for a total of 80 seats, of which 6 of those seats are allowed to go to applicants that don't come from the maritime regions. Now, there's no minimum GPA for this school, but on average, the successful applicants had a GPA that was greater than 85%. Now, they do use the MCAT test, they use the entire MCAT test, and there's no minimums, but on average, what you'll see is the applicants had between a 125 and a 127 on each section if they got in. Now, the school does use the CASPer test, and in terms of the non-academic requirements, you're going to need 2 letters of reference, as well as a supplementary application that you're going to fill out via the CARMS website. Finally, in terms of the selection process, I couldn't really find what the overall method of picking the applicants was, other than that the school uses a very holistic approach, where academics are important to them, but they also consider many different parts of an application. Now, when it comes to the Quebec Medical Schools, there's actually 4. There's 1 English-speaking school, and then there's 3 schools that only offer the curriculum in French. Unfortunately though, they also only offer the requirements in French and only talk about how to get into the school in French. To be honest, my French really isn't at that level where it needs to be, where I could understand all the intricacies of applications for those schools. So this is where I'm going to reach out to you guys a little bit. I want this guide to be absolutely complete. Unfortunately, this section is going to get a little bit shady, but if you guys know exactly how to get into the French-speaking medical schools, please feel free to leave that in the comment section below. I'll pin the comment, and that way everyone else will be able to see what they need to do to get into those programs. So we'll start off with the easy one then. That's McGill Medical School, the only Quebec medical school that offers the curriculum in English. They had 3,000 applications for a total of 180 seats. What's really important to note is that McGill has a whole bunch of different applicant categories, but in total there's about 10 seats that are allowed for out-of-province applicants. For the GPA, on average for the Quebec applicants, they had a GPA of about 3.89, and for the other Canadian applicants, it was about 3.95. Now, I just want to note that McGill also encourages international students to apply if they meet the requirements. What's interesting here is that the MCAT test for McGill is actually optional. It's not required, and if you do submit your MCAT test, it'll only be used for your application if it's going to make your application more competitive. The school does use the CASPer test, and in terms of the non-academic requirements, you're going to need to fill out your McGill CV form, which is going to look at things like your extracurriculars, your work experiences, all of the usual stuff. In terms of the selection process, pre-interview, it's going to be 20% CASPer, 10% your CV, and then 70% your academic review, which is going to be broken down into 90% your GPA, and then 10% your academic context, which is calculated using a few different things which you can find on their website. Post-interview though, 100% of the final decision as to who makes it into the class is going to be based off of the MMI. Now, in terms of the French-speaking Quebec medical schools, there's 3 of them, so that's going to be Laval, Sherbrooke, and Montreal. And the reason why I'm just so unsure about these schools, or one of the reasons why anyways, is because I'm just not overall familiar with the way that the education system works down there. For example, most places in North America, you'll do 4 years of high school and then 4 years of university. But down in Quebec, it's one of the only places in North America where you'll do 3 years in high school, 2 years in pre-university, or that's CEGEP program, and then finally an additional 3 years of your undergrad. So I'm gonna have my sheets up on the screen, or my uncompleted sheets for this section. If you guys are able to fill them in, please do so and leave them in the comment section below. But the things that I am sure about is that all 3 of the French medical schools require the CASPer test. You're gonna have to write it in French. And then in addition, their curriculum is going to be entirely in French. So if you're applying from outside of Quebec, you need to go ahead and pass a French proficiency test. Finally, the MMI format for their interview is going to be called the MEM for the Quebec medical schools, and that's basically a modified MMI that they're using. And now finally, to wrap up this guide, we're going back to the Ontario medical schools because those are the ones that I am the most familiar with. Starting off with McMaster University, which is actually the school that I'm at. For the acceptance stats, they get on average 5,228 applications for a total of 205-ish seats. In terms of GPA, the minimum that you need to even apply is a 3.0, and the average among all the students is a 3.87, but again, this is just an average. Students do get in with less than that, and you'll see that in a second. In terms of the MCAT, the minimum is going to be a 123, and McMaster will only look at the CARS section of the MCAT. The average, though, for all their applicants is about a 129. CASPer was actually invented by McMaster, so they not only use CASPer, but it is a very heavy consideration in the overall application. And then finally, for the non-academic requirements for all of the different Ontario universities, you're going to be filling out the OMSAS application. This is an online application service where you're going to include things like your extracurriculars, your autobiographical sketch in general, some references, and some other things on there. If you guys want to know more about the OMSAS application, I have another video talking about my entire OMSAS application and some tips and tricks about it as well. Now, what's interesting for McMaster is that even though you have to fill out your OMSAS application, they also break down their selection process and how they choose their applicants. Pre-interview, 32% of your application goes to GPA, 32% goes to your MCAT CAR score, and then finally 32% goes to your CASPer score. There's an additional up to 4% bonus that you could get. You get a 1% bonus if you have a master's degree, and a 4% bonus if you have a PhD, and that's a maximum of 4% bonus. After you make it to the interview stage though, they break it down into 70% for your MMI, that's the multiple mini interview, 15% for your GPA, and then 15% for your CARS. Now, medical school number 13 is Western University, or the Sherbrooke School of Medicine. They had 2,151 applicants for a total of 171 seats. In terms of the GPA, they're going to be looking at your two best years. Now, you need to meet a minimum of 3.7 in each of those two best years, but on average, their applicants had about a 3.91 for those 2 years. Now, Western does not use the CASPer test, and as far as the MCAT goes, they're also not going to be looking at the psychology and sociology sections. It's only going to be the first sections. What you need to do is meet a minimum for each of the different sections, then also a minimum for the overall remaining 3 sections. And those are going to be different if you're an applicant from Southwestern Ontario versus if you're an applicant that's not from Southwestern Ontario. Now, it was weird because they do have some conflicting information on there about what the actual minimums for the MCAT was. They were reported as 2 different values in 2 different places, but the average for the actual accepted applicants was a 129 in the physics section, a 128 in CARS, and then a 129 in biology. As far as the non-academic requirements go, what you need to do is fill out the OMSAS application, just like for the other Ontario schools, but you also need to do the Western-specific autobiographical sketch, which does have a few different sections on it. And then you have to do 4 to 8 OMSAS highlights, specifically identifying experiences from OMSAS that you want to present to Western as examples. In terms of how they select, there's 3 different steps. First, you're going to meet the academic cutoffs for GPA and MCAT. If you could do that, you're going to then progress to the full file review, looking at the non-academic requirements. They're going to read your essays. And if you get by that step, you'll finally progress to the panel interview before they select their final class. Next up is the University of Ottawa. So they had 4,294 applicants for a total of 116 seats. Of those seats, 116 are for the English stream, and then another 48 are for the French stream. Ottawa does have 2 different streams, and one of them is only offered in French. As far as the prerequisite courses go, there are a few of them, and in terms of new additions, I believe statistics is new. Like when I applied to Ottawa back in the day, I don't think statistics was a mandatory course. As far as GPA goes, the school does not look at the MCAT, so they do really value like the GPA part of your application. The minimum to apply is supposedly a 3.5 out of 4. However, this fluctuates every single year. They don't list the individual GPA cutoffs for that year, but you are allowed to call Ottawa and ask what the GPA cutoff was for the previous cycle. And there's lots of reports online saying that this is usually around the 3.85 from people claiming to have called the university and have asked them themselves. Now, Ottawa does use the CASPer test as part of their selection criteria. Now, in terms of how they do that specifically, pre-interview, your score is going to be made up of just the CASPer test, your GPA, and then your autobiographical sketch from OMSAS. Then in terms of post-interview, it's basically just your GPA and your score from the actual interview day. Next up, we have Queen's University Medical School. They get about 2,000 applicants that actually make it to the full final review for a final class size of only 100, plus an additional 5 spaces for international students. Now, as far as the GPA goes, they're either going to use a 2-year GPA or the overall GPA, whichever one is going to be better for the individual applicant. And you're just using your GPA in the beginning to meet a cutoff. Now, as far as what the cutoffs are, it's actually unreported by the university, but they speculate online that it's around the 3.7. Now, the school doesn't use the CASPer test, but they do use the MCAT. And as far as the MCAT goes, you have to meet specific requirements for the overall test as well as the individual sections. There's going to be minimums set per application cycle, and again, they don't publish what those actual cutoffs are going to be. In terms of the actual non-academic requirements, it's just the OMSAS ABS and then your references. And finally, for the selection process, it's going to be different steps where basically every single step, they're just weeding out more applicants until they get to the 2,000 applicants to progress to the full file review. After that, it's just the interview, and then finally, they're going to generate a list of the top 100 applicants after all of those steps. Next is going to be the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, which is actually the smallest medical school in all of Canada. Canada. They had about 2,003 applications for a total of 64 seats in the final class. 57 of those seats went to residents that were specifically from Northern Ontario, and the other 7 seats went from people that were from Northern Canada and then also the remainder of Canada. So they do place a very heavy focus on applicants from rural parts of Ontario and then other things. You're going to see that factor in a little bit more when we talk about the context score. As far as the MCAT and CASPer tests go though, none of those are used for the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. And as far as GPA goes, the minimum that you need is a 3 out of 4 to apply, but you'll see that the average is actually around a 3.86 out of 4. What's really interesting though is that if you have a graduate degree, you're awarded an additional 0.2 to your final GPA. So if you're at like a 3.6 before and you have a master's degree, you'll actually now be at like a 3.8, which is a very substantial boost. Now there are quite a few non-academic requirements. I've listed them all there, but what I want to highlight is the context score, where there are points that are awarded from applicants that are coming from like a rural background. And there's a few other different categories on there. In terms of the actual selection process, pre-interview, 1/3 is going to go to the GPA, 1/3 to your ABS, and also the Northern Ontario School of Medicine questions. And the remaining 1/3 is going to be given for the context score that we just talked about. After the interview though, 50% of your score is going to be from all the stuff that came before the interview, and that remaining 50% is going to be all about how you did on interview day. And finally, the last medical school that we're going to be talking about is the University of Toronto Medical School. What you're going to see is they had 3,265 applications for a total of 259 seats in the class. They do have some prerequisite courses, but they are a little bit flexible as to which ones you get to take. And as far as GPA goes, the minimum that you need to apply is a 3.6 if you're applying in the undergraduate pool and a 3.0 if you're applying in the graduate pool. But what you're going to see is that really neither of those two are necessarily going to be competitive. The average for U of T, based on their weighting formula, is about a 3.96. Now U of T doesn't use the CASPer exam, or at least they don't use it yet. And as far as the MCAT goes, they really don't place a whole lot of emphasis on that either. It's just used as a cutoff. You have to get a 125 in every single section, except for one of the sections where you're actually allowed to get a 124, but not lower than that, and it's only a 124 in one of the sections. Finally, for the non-academic requirements, it's going to be all of the traditional OMSAS things that you have to do for all of the other schools, but then up to 4 U of T essays, and this might change in the future, but they're going to be essays that are posted on their website. There's different questions that they ask, and you have to go ahead and answer them based off of the CanMed roles and the different experiences that you've had in your life. Now, as far as the selection process goes, there's nothing officially published about it, but what's really interesting about U of T is they're one of the schools that don't send out all of their interview invites all at once, but instead, interview invites come out in waves all the way up until the final interview day. Alright guys, and that is it. That is my unofficial application guide, everything that I could find about every single one of the Canadian medical schools. Hopefully this is going to be a great, freely available resource for a lot of pre-meds out there. Now, I don't know if you guys could tell, but this video literally took me forever, and I haven't even scratched the surface for a lot of these things, especially when it comes to the different applicant pools, like the Black applicant pool, the Canadian military applicant pool, the Indigenous applicant pools. There are a ton of different things for the schools, but if you still want to look up more, please go ahead and check directly with the websites. It's always going to be your best bet. Now, hopefully this goes without saying, but for the legal purposes, I do want to actually say it. I am not affiliated with any of these institutions, either officially or otherwise. I'm just a current student trying to help out. If you guys want to pay it forward, feel free to subscribe to the channel. There's new videos coming out every single week. But other than that, I hope you guys have the best application cycle that you possibly can, and I wish you all the best of luck. But other than that, we'll see you guys all in the next one. Everyone take care.